there is a cultural nation that depends on our heroes, on our symbols, that I think is under assault. And if left undefended, we'll sort of strip away the foundations of the nation.
Rich, welcome to AI. You're the editor-in-chief for National Review, and you've got a great new book I enjoyed reading. It's called The Case for Nationalism.
Thank you.
And I have a book out as well on the same topic, Age of Iron. So
your title's better, I think. More creative.
Well, let me ask you, what, in your view, what is the case for nationalism?
Well, and we cover broadly the same ground, except for you have more foreign policy focus and I have a broader gauge focus. And I really make two arguments. One, nationalism is a general phenomenon, is misunderstood, it is unjustly smeared and frowned upon. It's a very old force, it's a natural force, it's a powerful force in general. And then the balance of my book, though, is about American nationalism. And, you know, there are better and worse forms of nationalism. I think American nationalism is better than other forms around the world, and that this was just within the mainstream of the American tradition broadly. You make that case with regard to the foreign policy tradition, and the country wouldn't be what it is. It wouldn't have been able to create the order it has, to advance the ideals it has, if it weren't for this kind of foundation in nationalism. Our revolution was a nationalist revolution. We could have been Canada, you know, living within a liberal empire. The British Empire, we decided to go our own way. After the revolution, when it seemed as though the central government was just going to collapse into these statelets that couldn't effectively govern or push back against potential foreign adversaries, we have this great nationalist event, which is the drafting and ratification of the Constitution. We then proceed to take land all the way to the Pacific Ocean in a great nationalist enterprise with, as you described, you know, great geopolitical ramifications, because we didn't want any of these other European powers hanging around on a periphery. Had the Civil War, which legitimizes and reinforces the American nation state. And then you have the 20th century, where American statesmen broadly support the creation of free, independent nation states around the world. Now that gets complicated because it involves Woodrow Wilson at the outset, and as you so ably describe, he's a complicated figure, a nationalist in some ways, but also wanted to ratify this Treaty of Versailles, which would have been one of the most significant crimps in our sovereignty in our history, in all likelihood.
So, Rich, you described the Constitution as a nationalist endeavor. It's often described as a classical liberal document,
Yeah.
emphasis on individual rights and popular sovereignty.
Yeah.
Is that a contradiction?
Well, two things. One, is clearly a nationalist endeavor because the Articles of Confederation government was breaking down, and the whole impetus to draft the Constitution, remake the foundational document of our government, was to create a strong and capable government. One that's also limited. Obviously, that's the genius of the Constitution, is it manages to do both. But the animating idea is that we needed a national government, or we are going to fall apart and fall into disrepute all around the world, because our experiment in self-government was going to fail. Now, the question of liberalism is one that's obviously contentious now within conservatism, much more contentious than most of us would have guessed, you know, even a year ago. And there are some nationalists who call themselves post-liberal, who think there's a tension between nationalism and liberalism. I don't think there is. I think the Constitution, which is one of the buttresses of our nationhood, is a liberal document. And I think these kind of liberal ideas were seeded throughout our culture from the very beginning. And I think it's a mistake for people to think like, the founders started reading Locke and then they became liberals, where you get these ideas of consent and the importance of covenant from Protestant oratory from the very beginning. And the first covenant is the Mayflower Compact, and then it's replicated kind of over and over in colonies and towns, and then it is ultimately the model for the Constitution. So this is, again, a major theme of my book, that America is not just an idea. The idea is important, the ideals are important, but it's impossible to separate them from the culture at the outset.
Well, let me ask you, so you mentioned that nationalism is often used as a dirty word, and that's certainly true today, and you want to make a strict distinction between nationalism on the one hand, say fascism on the other.
Right.
So isn't fascism just a more extreme version of nationalism? I mean, aren't there some versions of nationalism that really are insidious, or do you want to defend all forms, or is it just the American form?
It's largely the American form, but people make the mistake that nationalism is inherently fascistic, and it's just not. It's older than fascism. Even the modern form existed arguably for 150 years before you got fascism, and then you get fascism in Europe, most notably in Italy and Germany, and Nazism's really the most extreme and heinous form of fascism, and is really based on biological racism and a neo-imperial vision. So Hitler obviously had a nationalistic appeal, but it was much more than that. And he wouldn't have been a Nazi if he was just a nationalist without all the other poisonous things added on top of it. And nationalism was a basis of resistance to his projects and other imperial projects in Europe across the centuries.
So for you, is it a civic nationalism that's distinct, or is it something else that makes American nationalism different?
Well, mainly that we're America,
Yeah.
and I spent a lot of time going into the cultural predicates of our nation and our national identity, which are rooted in England, especially in terms of the New England here, rooted in East Anglia, which is part of England that was most opposed to the crown, that was most commercially focused, that was most Protestant. And basically those people come here to Massachusetts Bay and have an enormous impact on our national identity going forward. And something I didn't know until I kind of delved into it was John Winthrop, within 2 or 3 years of coming here, was contemplating resisting royal authority because there was rumors that the king was going to come and crack down on this experiment here in Massachusetts Bay and take back the charter, which they had brought over from England because there was a loophole that they took advantage of, and they wanted that legitimizing aspect of their autonomy right here rather than over in England. And they put a beacon on Beacon Hill, which has been known henceforth as Beacon Hill. They fortified, they trained militia, and 150 years before the Revolution, you had a potential revolt against royal authority centered in Boston, Massachusetts.
It's one of the things I found most interesting about your book was that American cultural nationalism isn't just a set of abstract ideas. It's things that ordinary citizens value, like Thanksgiving, the Super Bowl, Elvis, right? Tell us, what do you mean by cultural nationalism, and is it actually the government? You say we need to defend it. Is it the government's role to defend it, or how does that work?
Well, I think it's the role of the people to defend it, but there is a cultural nation that depends on our heroes, on our symbols, on our rites and rituals that I think is under assault. And I think if it left undefended, we'll sort of strip away the foundations of the nation. And people inherently, just through human nature, they want to be loyal to something. And you potentially will get, and we see some of this already, subnational and racial loyalties trumping loyalty to the nation. And I think that would take us to a very scary place. I deal a little bit with civic nationalism because people they create an opposition between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. But I don't think it's that simple. I don't think America can be reduced just to ideas or ideals. The way I think about it, an American tourist goes to a beer garden in Munich. No one says, I think that guy is an American because he believes in the Declaration of Independence. I think that he's American because of the way he dresses, because of the way he talks, because how friendly and boisterous he is. Maybe he's overweight, but there are all these markers of our Americanhood that go beyond just our political ideals, even though those ideals are important.
So if cultural nationalism in America is under assault, who's assaulting it?
Well, the left, mainly. And this has been a long-running effort to dethrone American history, to not teach it, or if you do teach it, to make it the story of vile repression from beginning to end. We see an extreme example of this with the so-called 1619 Project by the New York Times, and to undermine our heroes. And after the neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville and the disturbance there was a historic church in Alexandria that removed a plaque honoring Robert E. Lee, maybe understandable, but also George Washington, which is just absolutely insane. Thomas Jefferson is under a lot of pressure. It wouldn't shock me if 20 years from now there's not a Jefferson memorial. So these are just pillars of our nationhood that are under stress.
Are you disturbed by the way American history is taught in American schools? And I don't just mean universities, but actually right down to elementary school, high school. Are there patterns that you've noticed over the years of the way history is taught to American kids?
Yeah, something I didn't realize until I got into it in my book is really history education as we know it was created after the Civil War, where the Union veterans went and pushed and got patriotic education instilled into our schools. And some of it, was probably too saccharine, probably skipped over our nation's sins too readily, but it was an important unifying element of this country and its education system, and that's just gone. You're lucky if history is taught at all, especially in our colleges now, and the story has been twisted and increasingly defined by the work of Howard Zinn, the People's History of the United States, which was explicitly aimed at taking America down a notch, and for a lot of people has become the go-to work about this country.
Right, so now early American history and the progressive reading is sort of it's a history of sins or crimes that are overcome by progressives today.
Right.
And apologies.
Right, and the government is always the instrument
Yeah.
Of that. Now, there's no doubt that there are sins, and one thing, the lead essay in the New York Times 1619 Project, I think is dishonest in all sorts of ways. I've written about it at length. But what I think is true and what's very moving is the fact that African Americans, one, they're more American than most European Americans if you're just going to judge by tenure in this country, because they were brought here, then the importation of slaves was stopped, and there was no immigration of black people because the country was racist and didn't want them, and it was hard to get here. So the average African American has been here a very, very long time, and it's been African Americans who have oftentimes had to hold up our ideals when they were ignored by the rest of the country, and have participated in every American war, even when their domestic circumstances were incredibly dire. So I think there's a very moving aspect of our history.
That's a good point, I agree. At the very beginning of your book, you have a sentence which struck me. You say, what Trump realized, something like that, in 2016. The suggestion being that Republicans had forgotten something, and the Democrats had also forgotten something. What was it, for all his unusual personality, what did he realize that others didn't?
Well, he sensed, and I don't know how or why, but that this kind of nationalistic appeal had been pushed aside by both parties. The Democrats, because they're increasingly beholden to a progressive cosmopolitanism that's hostile to the idea of borders and sovereignty and national interest. And then also among Republicans, because in some of these things are good, but I think they're just taken to an extreme because you have a globe-trotting business elite that where borders don't mean so much, where you have a libertarian tendency in the party that I share to some extent, but is also thinks we're just one big world market and doesn't value borders very much, and also under the influence of evangelical Christianity, which is a wonderful thing. I'm a low church Protestant myself, but also, we saw it in George W. Bush's statement, and I think it was in 2000, about how family values don't stop at the Rio Grande, and that's true. But something important should stop at the Rio Grande, and Trump, in an exaggerated and crude way, he was on to that. And America First, when we initially heard that phrase, I can't speak for you, Colin, but for me initially I was like, we don't need to revive that, we don't need to go back there.
Right.
But most people don't know the history, and they're just hearing someone say, well, we're going to put our interests and values first, which was a corrective to the overreach of the Iraq War, the disappointments of the Iraq War. But now we're getting into your territory. So what do you think that Trump realized that others didn't?
Well, I think on foreign policy, there was a wing of the party that had come to see well-intentioned interventions in the Muslim world as problematic, not only in retrospect, but also during the Obama years, Libya,
right,
and so on. I mean, I think there was a shift, and there was still one wing of the Republican Party and of conservatives who continued to believe that the U.S. needs to promote a freedom agenda. But I don't think it was a coincidence. If you think about that moment where Donald Trump said in the debate, an early debate, that Iraq was a mistake. And that was sort of something you weren't supposed to say as a top Republican candidate, unless you were Rand Paul. But he said it, and it didn't seem to hurt him. So it sort of broke open the possibilities on foreign policy, I think.
Right, and then everyone said it was a mistake.
Yeah.
But he didn't just say that, he said it was a war waged on lies,
Yeah.
which I think he said that in the South Carolina debate, and that's just one of the moments I would have thought the day before yesterday this would destroy someone saying this,
Yeah.
but it's clearly not going to, and we're in a different place, a different world.
Yeah.
So what does his foreign policy harken back to?
Yeah.
Some people look back to the Jacksonian tradition. I've written about that myself. Is it that? Is it something
Good.
else?
And by the way, just as a side point, I'm sure you probably agree, but I don't think Bush did lie.
No, of course
but
not. Of course
that was
not.
kind of a talking
Right.
point. But I think in retrospect there were some mistaken assumptions in 2003, just the ease with which the U.S.
Right.
could democraze that country.
The problem is we didn't know anything about Iraq.
Yeah, well, that's a problem.
And then we learned lots of unwelcome things once we were there.
Right. So I see different tendencies. Like you, when I first heard America First, I thought Charles Lindbergh, but it's not clear that Trump had that in mind. He probably didn't have that in mind at all.
No.
He just meant American interests first. Trump clearly wants to reject the Bush legacy. He doesn't really remind me much of Reagan. Reagan had that kind of muscular idealism, although he was very practical in reality. I think Nixon is a comparison, just in the sense that you have a Republican come in very hard-nosed after some frustrating quagmire or perception of such. And the president says, you know what, we're going to have new possibilities on diplomacy with our former adversaries. We're going to retrench a little bit. We're going to stay tough on defense, but we're going to try to do something creative and sort of a fighting retreat in a number of places. There's a little bit of Nixon in Trump, I think, in that way. They're very different personalities. I mean, Nixon had much more experience in these things. But there's a bit of a Nixonian quality. The other thing you can do is you can go even further back and say that Trump, it really is kind of hearkening back to pre-World War II traditions, let's say the 20s, where you had a very popular Republican formula at the time, which was to say, we're going to have tariffs, we're going to try to remain detached from foreign wars, we're going to have more restrictions on immigration. And for Republicans in the 20s, that was popular until it wasn't.
Right. So I mentioned Wilson a little bit. Obviously, you deal with this at much greater length and know it much better. So there's kind of a lazy conventional wisdom on the left, or just maybe among everyone, that it was the League of Nations was brought down by isolationists, and this was a bad thing, and created the predicate for World War II. So, one, who brought it down? What were the different strands among the people who opposed the treaty, and what role did it play in the subsequent conflict?
Really, it was Wilson that brought it down by being so uncompromising. I mean, his vision was we have to make a formal commitment to defend every other country on the planet. And actually, a lot of Republicans, most Senate Republicans, like Henry Cabot Lodge, for example, in Massachusetts, the key figure really, said, I'm happy to make an alliance with France and Britain, something like NATO. You could have had NATO 30 years earlier and helped deter Nazi Germany. Lodge was ready to do that, and actually most Senate Republicans were as well. So they weren't isolationists. They were just skeptical of Wilson's particular concept, that we're going to make this universal, global, binding, multilateral commitment. And their argument was, we know we're not going to defend every other country on earth, so why pretend we will?
Right.
Of course, Wilson disagreed, insisted on his version, and so couldn't get the votes, the 2/3 of the vote. There was a faction of Republicans in the Senate, mostly Western populists and progressives, who really didn't want any such commitment. They just wanted the U.S. to go back into kind of strategic disengagement after World War I. But you know, in the 1920s, it was kind of the most non-interventionist wing that won in the end. Harding decided, he just said, we're not even going to talk about the League. I'm done with the League. Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover. So that was fine for as long as it lasted. In the long term, of course, it didn't work because it meant that the U.S. was locked into this very disengaged posture and wasn't really doing much to stop Hitler until he was, you know, well on his way.
So that might be getting us down to a rabbit hole. But if we had done more to buttress Britain and France, is there anything they could have done preemptively that would have stopped the conflagration or stopped Hitler from marching across much of Europe?
You know, Winston Churchill called World War II the unnecessary war because he thought that if Hitler had been faced down earlier, you wouldn't have needed this incredibly violent catastrophe for the planet, you know?
Right.
And so if you'd had a U.S. alliance with all of the economic and potential military weight that the U.S. had, allied with Britain and France, at a minimum, it's possible it could have deterred Hitler. Something like a NATO would have been worth trying, it seems to me.
Right.
But, you know, we didn't try. And what we found in the end was we had to do strategic reentry, which is to say you completely disengage and then you have to go back in. So D-Day, 1944, is an example of strategic reentry. It's expensive. It's costly, not just in money,
that was
but
a hell of a strategic reentry. Yeah.
So that's the worry I've always had. One of the reasons I was initially quite concerned about Trump is it sounded to me like he was tinkering or experimenting with really deep forms of disengagement. You know, in the end, he hasn't actually done that. Obama actually did that in Iraq by just walking away from Iraq.
And we had a strategic reentry.
Exactly.
Not like D-Day, but we had to go back.
And we had to go back a few years later because of ISIS. So the lesson, I think, in American history has been when you completely disengage, you actually end up having to go back at greater cost.
Right. So why has that initial fear of yours not been realized, or why don't you think, you know, the very serious people that think President Trump represents a threat to this liberal system of values that and rules we've created around the world, that he's not vested in it, push comes to shove, he's not going to defend it, and you'll have chaos or Chinese-based rules or something that's much better, much worse for us in the long term.
Right, that is a concern. It's a widespread concern. However, I don't think Trump gets up in the morning and thinks to himself, how can I wreck the liberal world order? I don't think he thinks about it one way or the other, which in a way is the point.
Right, but isn't that a bad thing?
Well, you know, I think he's trying to promote what he views as U.S. relative interests in the world, trying to carve out gains in relation to competitors and also allies. I'm not a big fan of trade wars with U.S. allies, but that seems to be what he's doing. He's trying to redress what he sees as free riding by U.S. allies, get them to spend more on defense, you know, and then push on Iran, push on North Korea, push on China, and see if you can get a deal. That wouldn't have been my ideal foreign policy as of 2016, but that's what he's doing. That's not the same thing as saying, I'm out to wreck liberal world order. I mean, a lot of these institutions like NATO have actually survived for all the controversy and the stylistic problems. I mean, they're still there. In fact, there's more U.S. troops in Poland than there were under Obama. So, you know, in reality...
And Ukraine's getting more javelins.
Right, exactly.
So just a little hiccup there.
There was a little hiccup. There was a little hiccup. Yeah, no, I mean, actually, in reality, on Ukraine, I mean, you look at the administration, you've had increased military aid, diplomatic aid, economic aid. I mean, so ever since 2014, the U.S. has actually been bolstering Ukraine against Russia.
Right.
So, you know, I think your question was why. I think it's probably a combination of things. It could be partly that Trump himself was never fully convinced in the first place that you needed to completely disengage. It's possible that what he wanted was just to carve out gains for the U.S. in his own mind, and then say, you know, hey, I've got some wins, re-elect me. Now, he is unpredictable. We don't know what he'll do in his second term on foreign policy. But I imagine that going into the re-election campaign, he'll say, look, I've downsized in Afghanistan. We rolled back ISIS. I've got new trade agreements. I've pushed hard on China. Maybe there's a ceasefire agreement on that, on the trade dispute. I've got our allies to spend more in defense. You know, it's a win. I mean, that's going to be his platform, and then people will decide for themselves whether they buy it. But I think, I shared a lot of the concern initially, but just watching, if you just sort of turn the volume down and
which is impossible to do,
try to filter out what people are speculating about motives or the worst possible thing could happen, and just watch what he does on foreign policy. Not to say that it's all great by any means, but it's actually not as crazy as I think the most vociferous critics are suggesting.
So let's go all the way back. I write about this, and you do as well. The George Washington's farewell address, which is just a great state paper. And Hamilton is such a great founding father. I mean, he drafted this for Washington, but Washington, very carefully paid attention to it and edited it line by line. But how do you read it? Because the conventional reading is that it's almost an isolationist statement, which doesn't seem correct to me, and doesn't take account of the context where he's trying very deftly to walk this tightrope between Britain and France, which at that time are more powerful than we are, and knows if we just kind of hold our power and muster our strength, we'll be in a much better position decades hence.
Absolutely. I mean, at that time, it made perfect sense to stay out of a war with either Britain or France from the American point of view. And it also helps dampen domestic political disputes, which I think was part of Washington's concern. So when he lays out this concept that we can have temporary alliances, we can have commercial agreements, but no permanent alliances, it makes sense at that time. And I think, like you, I see a sort of nationalist American tradition right back to the founding, with Washington as the key figure. The farewell address lays it out. Now, the real question today is, what are the implications? What should a conservative nationalist believe today? It seems to me that some believe really that we should be disengaging from a lot of these alliances. My own view is that we don't have to. But I think that's going to be a debate in the coming years.
Definitely.
I'd be curious to hear your take on this, just the political side of it. Among people who call themselves nationalist conservatives in the U.S., there is a deep disagreement over how engaged should we be, how active should we get. There's an agreement on U.S. sovereignty is fundamental. There's an agreement on we promote U.S. interests, but there's a disagreement about how to do it.
Yeah, definitely. And it just gets down to a question that there's not any formulaic answer to. What's in the national interest, and how do you best promote the national interest? And just in any given instance, there are prudential considerations that have to be taken into account. There's just not any hard and fast answer. I think in general, like you, it's a forward-leaning posture, and we get more out of these alliances than they cost us, even if even if you're Donald Trump, sitting at the Resolute desk and adding up, how much we put in and how many others put in. It's still hugely important and a force multiplier to have these relationships. Now, I'm skeptical of big multinational ventures and treaties and institutions. Obviously, the worst is the UN. The EU's right up there with me, for me, but just alliances are important, and especially if the main national challenger going forward for the next 20 years is going to be China. It's a huge advantage to us to have a better relationship with all those countries, smaller countries around its periphery that think they could be in the path of a growing China.
No, I agree. I mean, actually, by the logic of Trump's own position, if you think China's the number one challenge, you're going to need allies. And fortunately, we still have them. Allies and partners in the region. And so we should really be working with them on trade as well as diplomacy and strategy to counteract China. We're not going to be able to do that by ourselves. And the Chinese will certainly take advantage of any U.S. disengagement.
But one argument, if Trump loses in 2020, which is not a foregone conclusion by any means. But if he does, one interpretation will be that he hit on this powerful thing, this populism and this nationalism, and just didn't follow it through to its logical conclusion, that he was too conventional. You know, he adopted a very traditional Republican domestic policy with the exception of tariffs and maybe another thing here or there. And despite sort of the bombast and the theatrical meetings with Kim, it was a very standard issue Republican foreign policy. And what the party needs next is to take Trumpism to the next level. So that'll be one argument if he loses. The other will be, well, he lost because he took Trumpism to the level that he did, and we did climb back down to the old Republican status quo.
Right.
And I would tend to think neither of those are a good answer, and it's important for people to, even if Trump faceplants in 2020, and again, I'm not predicting that, I'm not sure it's going to happen, but to think through what we've learned from him and from this phenomenon and learn the next step. And I think the foreign policy community can learn that from your book, and I'm hoping conservatives also can begin to think about that with my book as well.
Right. So the answer is, what do we learn from Trump without either accepting every single thing or rejecting every single thing?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Now, on immigration, this is a key argument in your book. I mean, if America isn't just an idea, that's going to have implications for your immigration policy, and you talk about that quite a bit.
Yeah, so people matter, and immigration flows matter. You know, I'm sure Mexico, if it had to go do over again, never would have let white Anglos settle in Texas in such such numbers. It created a big problem. And I reject the cliche that we're a nation of immigrants. It's true to some extent, but that doesn't mean that we've always had very high levels of immigration. It's gone up and down. Sometimes when it's gone down, it's been for bad and bigoted reasons. But I think we've been at elevated levels of legal immigration for quite a long time now. We haven't paid enough attention to basically recruiting people around the world who have the skills best suited to thrive immediately in a 21st century economy of the sort we have now. In the late 19th and early 20th century, you could take the inflow coming through New York Harbor and just plug them into manufacturing jobs. I'm simplifying, and it worked. But the skill difference between the immigrants then and natives wasn't nearly as high as it is now, and we don't have that great industrial maw anymore to feed low-skilled labor into, and all the kind of instruments of assimilation that we had. And it's just amazing when you look back. It's just the foundations, the schools, business, nonprofits. Everyone was focused on how do we Americanize these folks, and took it as just a given that was a good thing. And that could be uncomfortable, for the immigrants. You're kind of pushing them one way rather than just letting them find their own way. But it was good for us as a society. And then also part of that story that people neglect is after 1924, we go radically down in our levels for the next 30, 40 years. So the ethnic enclaves that you saw developing when levels were particularly high at the beginning of the 20th century dissolve. And just the chances are you're an Italian American, you're going to marry someone who's not Italian American, and you still might have fond associations, you still might eat a certain kind of food, you might like the old country, but your really strong attachment to Italy has been dissolved. And then just final point, it was just harder to maintain a connection to your old country then than it is now, because travel was harder. There was no text and TV. So once you were here, you were here.
So if I go down a checklist of, let's say, some practical policy implications, give me a sense of would you be in favor, shift from family unification to skills-based, the border security wall, actually reducing levels of legal immigration. What's your view on those?
Yeah, I think, I don't have a well-formulated thought for you on what overall numbers should be in terms of legal immigration, but I think less would be called for, and certainly a different mix. Now, you always have to have some element of family reunification, spouses and minor children, But we've gone way overboard on that and haven't paid attention to skills the way other advanced English-speaking countries do. Canada and Australia are the examples. And this is just a theme that's throughout my book and was really brought home to me in a profound way. Language is so important. That's kind of the ultimate cultural glue of any people. So I would want to value people who already speak English. Now there's some will say, oh, there you go, you just want white immigrants. Well, it's not true. I think that the country with the most English speakers is probably India, or in Philippines and Nigeria, way up the list. And all sorts of people in other countries learn English. But I would have a point system that included levels of education, business experience, and English acquisition.
So coming back to the earlier topic on sort of the future of American nationalism after Trump, whether it's one term, two terms, we talked about what should happen, right? Learn the right lessons, don't learn the wrong ones.
Right.
What do you think is most likely? What does the future look like? If you were going to make some tough predictions, 5, 10 years from now, what is the Republican Party going to look like? It seems as though it's becoming a more blue-collar party in some ways. Working class voters over a long-term period of time have become more important, and Trump just accelerated that.
Yeah.
There's almost been a flip between the two parties on this. So does that mean, for example, that you have a party that's more Rust Belt, protectionist, working class as a long-term trend, or do we think of Trump as just kind of a temporary blip?
Right. So you're right that this was a trend, the more working class element of the Republican Party before Trump, and the two parties basically swapping. Republicans trading upper middle class, suburbanites to the Democrats in exchange for white working class voters. So that was a trend prior to Trump, but Trump accented it and really underlined it, accelerated it. So this is just, I'm out of the prediction game forever, but based on a straight line trajectory, you would say yes, that Republicans, a couple elections now, Texas could be a purple state. And it's possible to make it up, but the only way you make it up is through the upper Midwest and Pennsylvania. So it's going to have to be some sort of more populist and nationalist appeal than Republicans had prior to Trump. Those states need to be really competitive going forward. And how you do that, consistent with some important elements of Republican orthodoxy, including spending and debt and entitlement reform, is a really big question. I think there's probably some way to square the circle, but it will require a lot of thought.
Very good.
And just one last thing on Trump. This is the promise of his populism and nationalism that he hasn't realized because he's not interested enough in it, and just he's so combative and divisive. Is patriotism is really important to a lot of people, and not just white people. Right? Populist economics oriented around working class concerns is important to a lot of people, and connect with a lot of people, and not just white people, right? It's not just, we tend to think, we'd say the white working class, but there are tons of black working class people, Hispanic working class people. And I think Trump would have a natural appeal to a certain kind of working class, middle class, black, Hispanic male if he really worked it every single day and thought about how do I reach those people. And made a more truly nationalistic appeal, because a huge element of nationalism is this common feeling and the sense of national unity. It runs through every nationalist document and statement of importance through our history. And that's something that, unless Trump's on the teleprompter, he totally leaves aside to his own detriment and that of the party and the country.
Well, it's been a great conversation. Thank you, Rich.
Thanks so much, Colin.
Thank
Congratulations
you.
on your book.
Thank you, too. Hi, everyone. That's the end of our discussion with Rich Lowry. Thanks for watching. As always, let us know what other topics you'd like AAI scholars to cover on Viewpoint. And to learn more about conservative American nationalism, check the links in the description below.